She should not have been there. That was the singular, devastating truth that struck His Grace Aldrich Pemberton, the Duke of Ashenvale, the very moment he pushed open the heavy oak door of his private chambers and found her, standing amongst his most intimate possessions, her slender fingers pressed flat against the mahogany surface of his writing desk, her eyes wide and luminous in the trembling light of a single tallow candle. Miss Cecily Vane, the daughter of the Right Honourable Judge Edmund Vane, the very man who held Aldrich's entire future clasped within the iron grip of his judicial authority. For one breathless, suspended moment, neither of them moved. The fire in the hearth had burned low, reduced to smouldering amber coals that cast long wavering shadows across the walls. A cold draught pressed through the gap beneath the chamber door, making the candle flame bend and shiver, as though it too recoiled from the sheer impropriety of the scene. The hour was well past midnight. The rest of Ashenvale Manor lay silent as a cathedral, and yet here she stood. Cecily Vane's countenance was a portrait of exquisite anguish. Her dark hair, usually pinned with such meticulous propriety, had come loose at one temple, a single curl trailing against the pale column of her neck. Her gown, a deep burgundy silk that rustled like distant thunder when she moved, was slightly disordered at the sleeve, as though she had dressed in considerable haste. Her eyes, those extraordinary grey eyes that Aldrich had endeavoured, with considerable and unsuccessful effort, to forget since the evening of Lady Harcastle's museal, were fixed on him with an expression caught precisely between terror and something else, something he dared not name. "Your Grace," her voice was barely a whisper, threaded through with a tremor she could not fully suppress, "I can explain." Aldrich stepped into the chamber fully and closed the door behind him. The quiet click of the latch seemed in that breathless silence as loud as the report of a pistol. "I sincerely hope," he said, his voice low and utterly controlled, in the manner of a man who had long since mastered the art of concealing turbulence behind composure, "for I confess my imagination, considerable as it may be, struggles to furnish a satisfactory account of your presence here." She drew herself upright. He had always admired that about her, the way she could gather dignity around herself like armor, even in moments that would have reduced lesser women to collapse. "There are letters," she said, "letters that my father—" She faltered, and then pressed on. "Letters that my father wrote, Your Grace. Letters that I have reason to believe are here, within this room. Letters that, if they were to be entered into evidence at tomorrow's hearing, would destroy him utterly." Now, before we go any further into this extraordinary evening, if you are finding yourself breathless already, you are precisely where I want you. If you are new to this channel, welcome to the Duke's Lost Letters. Please do take a moment to like this story and subscribe so that you never miss a single scandalous chapter. Now, let us return to the chambers of Ashenvale Manor, where Miss Cecily Vane has just made a confession that has entirely altered the nature of the evening. Aldrich regarded her for a long, measuring moment. The firelight painted the planes of his face in gold and shadow, the sharp jaw, the dark brow drawn into a slight furrow, the mouth that was perhaps too uncompromising to be called handsome, and yet was impossible to look away from. He had spent the better part of 3 months fighting for his family's honor in the Court of Chancery, where Judge Edmund Vane presided with the cold, impartial authority of a man who worshipped order above all things. The case concerned the Ashenvale estate itself, a disputed inheritance, a fraudulent codicil, and a web of deception that reached back 2 generations. Tomorrow, at the final hearing, everything would be decided. And now the judge's own daughter stood in his private chambers at midnight, confessing to the search for correspondence that implicated her father in the very fraud Aldrich sought to expose.
The irony was not lost on him. It settled, in fact, with considerable weight. "Sit down, Miss Vane," he said, not unkindly. She hesitated. Then, with a rustle of silk and the whisper of her slippers against the turkey rug, she moved to the wing-back chair beside the dying fire and sat. Her hands were folded in her lap with great deliberateness, the deliberateness of a woman preventing them from trembling. Aldrich crossed to the sideboard, poured 2 glasses of Madeira, and set one before her without remark. Then he took up his position standing before the mantelpiece, one hand resting upon the cool marble, and looked at her steadily. "Tell me everything," he said, "from the beginning. Leave nothing out." And so she did. She told him how she had for months harbored a growing and terrible suspicion about her father, about certain private meetings conducted with discretion that had no innocent explanation, about correspondence received and swiftly burned, about a name she had heard spoken in hushed tones behind a closed study door, the name Pemberton. She had not wanted to believe it. He was her father. He had raised her alone since the death of her mother, given her every advantage his considerable position afforded, had been, in all outward aspects of his life, a man of unimpeachable rectitude. But suspicion, once planted in a perceptive mind, is an extraordinarily tenacious vine. She had followed a thread. It had led her through a sequence of events too convoluted to have been engineered, to the knowledge that her father had, 15 years ago, been complicit in the falsification of the Ashenvale codicil, had, in exchange for a substantial private consideration, lent the weight of his early legal opinion to a document he knew to be fraudulent, and the evidence, the sole remaining evidence, was a series of letters written in his own hand that had been given for safekeeping years ago to a man whose effects had eventually passed, through inheritance and the strange circularity of fate, into the possession of the Duke of Ashenvale himself. Aldrich listened without interruption. He was, by constitution and by discipline, an extraordinarily still man when he chose to be, but beneath that stillness something moved, something complex and unresolved, pulled in directions that troubled him, because he had known. He had possessed those letters for weeks. He had studied them. He had intended to present them at tomorrow's hearing and watch the edifice of Edmund Vane's reputation crumble before the court like a condemned wall before the wrecking iron. He had not, until this moment, allowed himself to consider what that would mean for Cecily Vane.
When she had finished, the silence in the chamber was of a different quality than it had been before, heavier, more inhabited. "You came here," he said, "to find the letters before I could present them." "Yes," she admitted, and the word cost her something visible. "I came to ask, to beg, if I must, that you consider an alternative, that you consider," her voice caught, "that there is a daughter who loves her father, Your Grace, despite everything, that there is a family name which, however unworthily carried, is the only one I possess." Aldrich turned from the mantelpiece and looked at her, truly looked at her, in a way he had disciplined himself never to do. "And what," he asked very quietly, "would you offer me in exchange, Miss Vane? You came prepared with a bargain, I think." Her chin lifted. Those grey eyes met his with unflinching directness. "My father's written confession," she said, "signed and witnessed. His voluntary resignation from the bench, full restitution of the original sum received, and his testimony, in whatever private capacity you require, affirming the legitimacy of the Ashenvale inheritance beyond all future dispute." She paused. "He will not escape consequence, but he need not be destroyed in public before a courtroom gallery who will feast on his ruin. You would have everything you require, Your Grace, the estate, the vindication, every legal remedy, only not the spectacle." The fire shifted in the grate. A log subsided with a soft, exhausted sound, and a scatter of sparks rose briefly against the dark chimney throat before vanishing.
Aldrich was quiet for a very long time. He thought of his father, of the years of wrongful dispossession, the slow erosion of a proud man's dignity, the estate diminished, and the family name quietly mocked in the clubs and drawing-rooms of London. He thought of the justice he had promised himself, cold and public and absolute. And then he looked at Cecily Vane, sitting in the firelight with the posture of a queen and the eyes of a woman who had walked into the lion's den, armed with nothing but courage and an impossible bargain. And he found, to his considerable consternation, that the cold and public justice was not the only thing he wanted. "I will need the confession delivered to my solicitor by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, signed, witnessed, and complete," he said at last. She exhaled, a long, unsteady breath that she had clearly been holding for some time. "It will be done," she said. He crossed the room then, not swiftly, but with a deliberateness that made the distance feel both very short and very significant, and he stood before her, offering his hand to assist her from the chair. "It occurs to me," he said, as she rose and stood close enough that he could see the faint pulse at her throat and the still trembling resolution in her eyes, that a woman capable of walking alone into a duke's chambers at midnight, armed with nothing but courage and an impossible bargain, is a woman of rather extraordinary character. "It occurs to me," she replied, with a ghost of something that might, under less strained circumstances, have become a smile, "that a duke who listens when all society expects him only to command is rather uncommon himself." He did not release her hand. The hearing the following morning was unremarkable in its brevity. The confession was delivered, the case was resolved, the Ashenvale estate was restored to its rightful heir without the theatre of public scandal. Judge Edmund Vane resigned his commission, citing ill health, and retired quietly to a modest property in Devonshire, where he lived out his remaining years in a dignity that was diminished but intact. And Aldrich Pemberton, the Duke of Ashenvale, who had entered those proceedings intent only upon justice, and had emerged from them contemplating something altogether more consequential, called upon Miss Cecily Vane for the first time entirely properly 3 weeks later. He called again the week after that, and the week after that. Society, of course, noticed. Society always notices. The whispers began in the drawing-rooms and accelerated through the ballrooms with the gleeful velocity of a well-aimed arrow. A duke and a disgraced judge's daughter. The impropriety, the audacity, the romance of it. What society did not know, what only 2 people in all England could have known in the privacy of a firelit chamber long after midnight, was that the most consequential negotiation in the history of the Ashenvale dukedom had been conducted over 2 glasses of untouched Madeira in the trembling light of a single candle, between a woman who loved too fiercely to be prudent and a man who had only just remembered how to feel. And there, dear listeners, the night draws its velvet curtain. If this story stirred something in your heart, a flutter, a sigh, perhaps an indignant gasp on Cecily's behalf, then this channel was made for you. Please give this story a like. It means the world and tells me you wish to hear more. And if you have not yet subscribed to the Duke's Lost Letters, do so now. New stories of passion, scandal, and Regency-era secrets are waiting for you. Until our next tale, good night.